Hi all, this is KB. I want to dispel the myth that combination knitters need to learn to decrease differently. That's absolutely not true. The truth is that we all knit in the same way, exactly the same. When we need a right-leaning decrease, we have Western stitches, right leg stitch in front, and we knit them together to form a right leaning decrease. To perform a left leaning decrease, we have our stitches in an Eastern stitch mount, and we knit them together to form the left leaning decrease. It's as simple as that. But let me elaborate. If you're not familiar with the terms Western and Eastern stitch mounts, please go back and watch my video, Part 2, Combined Knitting and Stitch Mounts. Let's go back to basics. When we knit two stitches together, one will lay over the top of the other. So we knit two stitches together to become one. Right here, we see the stitch from this column lay over the top of the stitch from this column and gives it the right leaning effect. And here we see the stitch from this column laying over this column to give the left leaning effect. When decreased stitches are formed in close proximity as this would, or possibly maybe the front neck of a sweater, we want them to mirror each other. Industry standards have designated the left leaning decrease to be the SSK, or slip slip knit. They've also designated this as the knit two together, or K2tog, a right leaning decrease. I heard somewhere this memory device that I use that knit two together has kind of an R, hard R sound like a pirate, and that is reminds me that it's a right leaning decrease. And slip slip knit, you hear the L in slip exaggerated, and that reminds me to do a left leaning decrease. I don't know, it might help. Use it if you like it. Industry standards always erroneously assume we're all working with Western mounted stitches, with our right stitch legs always in front. So when a pattern asks us to knit two together, or K2tog, they assume we have Western stitches. Now, we may or may not have Western stitches. Say, for instance, we're working a hat in the round stockingette, so we already have Western stitches. All we need to do is knit them together. Now, if we have Eastern stitches, we'll just reorient them and then we'll knit them together. And there we have right leaning decreases. Again, industry standards assume that we have Western stitches. So when they want a left leaning decrease in a pattern, they will tell us to slip, slip, knit. So I have Western stitches here. Look what happens when I slip, slip, knit. Let me back up a moment. There's a rule in knitting that when they ask us to slip a stitch during a decrease maneuver, it is to be understood that we are to slip knitwise, like this. Now, When a Western knitter, or we have Western stitches, and they ask us to slip, slip, knit, look what happens when I slip knitwise. I actually reorient that stitch to an Eastern stitch. And I knit them together. So if you're knitting along and you hear slip, slip, knit, the code word is slip, slip, means 2 Eastern stitches. You may already have Eastern stitches. In that case, just knit them together. And there we have 2 left-leaning stitches. Let's take a look at the decrease stitches that I've just made. The stitch that lays on the top is a nice open stitch. Left-leaning decreases. Again, that stitch is not crossed, twisted. Nice normal stitches. I'll review once again. Knit 2 together. I will knit them together. If I were to have Eastern stitches, I'd have to reorient them. Knit 2 together. Right leaning. Left leaning, I'll look now to see if I have Eastern stitches, and I will knit them together. If I were to have Western stitches, I would actually then do that slip, slip, knit and knit them together. Let's look at purling decreases. If a pattern, assuming you have Western stitch mounts, asks you to purl 2 together, that's it. However, if a pattern asks you to slip, slip, purl, remember that's code for reorienting our stitches to Eastern stitches with the right stitch leg and back. And when we purl 2 together, it's kind of my least favorite stitch to do. I come from behind, come through, and knit them together. Thank goodness it's rarely used in patterns. You know, they aren't very discernible from the side which way they lean or not. So if we turn to the stockingette stitch side, we can see that this purl 2 together does lean to the right. And here's our slip, slip, knit, and it leans to the left. So it's very similar thinking to the knit stitch. Thank you for watching. I want to remind you that knitting is knitting, and don't be afraid to knit different.